You ready to roll, Vince?
Always ready to rock. All right. Well, you were in the host side, so I didn't know if you were hosting.
What?
That's
you
on
didn't
me.
put yourself in the host side. Come on, man.
There we go. Hey, welcome everybody.
What would you say you do here? So that's one of my favorite scenes from any movie ever.
I got thrown by Toe Jam's comment. I'm not gonna lie. Before we roll into, I got thrown by this. It says, "Hello, IB Nation. Rest in peace, Ray Liotta. Goodfellas is a legendary movie that will live on forever." That was completely off my radar. I had no idea that Ray Liotta passed.
Yeah, it just happened.
That totally threw me as we were. It was like 3, 2, 1. Ray Liotta died. What? I was completely. That stinks, man. Wow, that is not the news I needed today. But we have other things to talk about today. It is Thursday, and it is May 26th, and it is the third quarter of the schedule. And we are going to chat about the third quarter, what it holds for Notre Dame, where Notre Dame should be going into the third quarter, and then what the third quarter means to this Notre Dame team and where it lies. Because, I mean, frankly, Brian, I don't think Notre Dame, in my personal opinion, Notre Dame should be nothing worse than 5-1 going into the third quarter with a lot of momentum. Frankly,
this is sort of a defining quarter. And before we dive too much into that, I do want to remind people that tonight at 7 o'clock, we will have a second show. Today, Jaden Lamar is going to decide between Notre Dame, Michigan, Oregon, and Arizona. We will carry his decision, talk about what it means for Notre Dame one way or the other, and just kind of go from there. But when you look at this third quarter, Vince, this is going to be the season-defining quarter. And I know right now all of our focus is on Ohio State, and everybody wants to talk about Ohio State and all this other kind of stuff. And Ohio State's important. Don't get me wrong. A win over Ohio State is huge. There's no question about it. A blowout loss, which has become become the norm for Notre Dame in such games in the last 20 years or so, is bad. There's no spin on that. The response to it, however, is it is the first game of the year, and we have seen a lot of teams lose early in the season and still go on to have very good seasons, great seasons, playoff seasons. I point to Ohio State again. And their championship year, they lost the second game of the year at home by 14 to a Virginia Tech team that went 7-6. Not only made the playoff, but won the national championship.
Right.
So this is the time of the schedule where it becomes, okay, who are you as a team? And again, it's not so much about Clemson as it is, Vince, the timing of the game. If you were to switch Clemson and Ohio State, I'd be saying the exact same thing.
Absolutely.
It's the timing of it, because this team is going to evolve. Now, I'm not saying this team is going to improve, because we have to learn all that about a Marcus Freeman Marcus Freeman coached football team. And we can say all we want about how confident we are in this, and we think that, and we both agreed that Marcus Freeman was the hire Notre Dame needed to make. But now he's got to prove that, and whether we think he will or won't, no one being objective can say that he doesn't need to prove that. He does need to prove that clearly. And this is the part of the season where that gets proven or not.
Yeah.
And that's the whole point. And so when you look at this, this part of the schedule, this is where it's going to get decided. And it's an interesting part of the schedule, because you could argue, if you break it down into threes and you go sequentially of those threes, this is arguably the most important point of the season. And people say, well, no, the finish is more important. Well, it does. The finish doesn't become important until this stage is successful.
No, that makes sense.
2 and 3 are successful, because if you lose the opener Ohio State, or if you lose to a BYU or North Carolina, you have a loss in the first 2 quarters, and you lose a game during this quarter. Now it's just about salvaging your season in the fourth quarter.
Yeah,
you're not a playoff contender until you get through this quarter with 1 loss or less.
Right.
That's the key. And that's why I say this is a very, very important part of the schedule. And it's also a part of the schedule where it starts off rather soft. With, in my opinion, the worst team on the schedule by far. And then there's a bit of a trap game in the middle. and then you've got Clemson. And so this part of the schedule with UNLV, Syracuse, and Clemson does become a very – I mean, because a 4-8 Syracuse team not that long ago ended up knocking off a team at home that not only went to the playoff but was a number 1 seed, and that was Clemson in 2017. Right. So you never take those games for granted, but at the same time, you know, if you're going to be the team that you think you're supposed to be, those are the games you have to win. The thing for me more, Vince, is more as we dive into those two opponents, it's more so about what kind of momentum do you build during this portion? Because if you look at the 2 quarters combined, you know, you've got that, you know, one of the tougher back-to-back games on the schedule in North Carolina and BYU, potentially.
Sure.
And then it ends with Stanford.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there's a chance that the Stanford, UNLV, Syracuse stretch is the easiest stretch of the season.
Right.
Potentially.
Sure.
So then it gets into, okay, it's not just about winning, but if you're the team that you think you need to be, it's like these need to be not just get-right games, but games where you really go out and start to build some rhythm and some momentum. And then carrying that into the final 4 games, which, you know, if we're to break it into thirds, the final third of Clemson, Boston College, and USC is huge for Notre Dame. Sure. That 3 games before gives you a chance to really build some momentum. So that's what makes the UNLV and Syracuse part of the schedule important. And a lot of people want to dismiss it as, oh, they're bad teams. And blah, blah. And that's fine, but you can win by 20 and still not better yourself as a football team. And that's why there needs to be a focus on those opponents, because it's not so much about the opponents per se, but it's about what are the matchups that they present, what are the things that you can learn about your football team, and then what kind of momentum can you build or lose heading into those big games. Because, you know, I'll point to 2015 for an example, Vince. Notre Dame lost a lot of momentum going into Stanford with the way they played against Wake Forest and BC, pair of 3-9 football teams. And I just don't think they were sloppy. And what hurt them against Stanford? Sloppy play. You know, Deshaun fumbling late in the first quarter, late first half when Notre Dame's driving after he has a long run. They end up fumbling and don't get points, you know, giving up big plays, missed assignments, things like that. That sloppy stuff hurt you in that game. Missed tackles, things along those lines, it hurt you. Well, that started building before that game. And that's the unique thing about football that I think really needs to be focused on. And that's why we like to look at these things holistically rather than just taking the 4 top opponents and acting like that's the entire season. That's how the season is defined. But when it comes to building your team, Vince, there's a lot more to it than just, you know, checking off the box of, okay, we beat UNLV, we beat Stanford, we beat Syracuse.
I will say, as we have kind of dove in a little bit more, you know, into these quarters and the way that the schedule is made up, you've got to give a lot of credit to Jack Swarbrick and the manner in which this schedule is put together, because when you break it up into quarters, they're very manageable quarters. I mean, there's obviously a big game, I think, in every quarter. And then there's kind of like a second tier game, I think, in every quarter. And then there's like kind of a, hey, we need to take care of business game in every quarter. Like I really like the way it's set up. In the past, some of the schedules that Notre Dame had was so front loaded. Like they had all of their tough games up front. And then the rest of the season was just like, you know, they need to be taking care of business the rest of the way. And their season was almost over if they happened to lose a couple of those games up front. You know what I mean? And so the way this schedule is set up, I just really like the way that it flows. I like where the bye is. I mean, there's just so much of it. And I realize some of it is out of Jack's control, but a lot of it is.
The ACC has to help as well.
Correct. Absolutely. And so I really like the way Jack has put together this schedule. And, you know, I don't know how much Brian Kelly had to do with it. I'm sure he had his input. And so I'll give credit there as well. But I just like the way that this schedule lines up from where the big opponents are, where the bye is, all of the above. I just really, like I said, there's been schedules in the past where you're like, what were they thinking with the way that they set this up? This one sets up very nicely.
It does. And there's enough of a test in this schedule where you do have 3, potentially 4 really good teams. Maybe it jumps up to 5 or 6 if North Carolina and Boston College are the teams we can be. Maybe it goes up to 7 if Stanford's the team that we think they can be. There's so many parts that go into this that you say, hey, look, boy, this is a challenging schedule, but it's also one in which you say it's built in a way, to your point, Vince, that it's manageable and it gives you a lot of building games. And that was the difficult part. And I love your reference to the earlier back before Jack Swarbrick really sort of changed the way that the schedule's put together. I mean, just go. It's like I was going through and just doing some research and just creating some things to kind of be able to have better search data. So like I'm going through like starting with Lou Holtz, going back and looking at the teams that Notre Dame played, and then the Davie era, the Willingham through the Kelly era, what were teams ranked when they played, what were teams ranked at the end of the season, all that kind of stuff. And you look at some of these schedules, especially in the 90s, it's like they were purposely trying to screw Notre Dame, the football program, over in the 90s. I mean, it was really bad. And to be honest with you, I thought Bob Davie got the worst of it. I mean, just some of the early season schedules he had were just a little bit like, you got to be kidding me. Like 1999, they played Kansas in the opener, but after that, it was Michigan, at Michigan, who was a top 10 team, at Purdue, who was ranked, at Michigan, or home against Michigan State, who was ranked. Then you got Oklahoma at home, then Arizona State, USC, Navy, at Tennessee, at Pittsburgh, home against Boston College, at Stanford. I mean, other than Navy, that's nothing but Power 5 teams.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, boy, I mean, again, Bob Davie was a bad coach. It made it even worse, which is why they went 5-7. But
still,
I mean, Lou Holtz, I mean, Brian Kelly, a lot of coaches would have had a tougher time working through that schedule. And that was kind of the thing that I thought doomed Lou Holtz at times, when they would have some of those losses where you're like, what? They lost to that team? And it's just like, because there's this constant, you always have to be up, that you're going to sometimes have those letdown games, like Stanford in 1992 and, Tennessee in 1991, where you kind of fade down the stretch and lose to those teams. And it's hard to get up every single week for those teams. And, this is a much more manageable schedule. It's still a little soft, in my opinion, to be honest with you. I mean, if you base it off of what these opponents were last year, the combined record of Notre Dame's opponents is 73-76. I mean, your schedule has a combined losing record. It's still a little softer than I think a Notre Dame schedule should be, but that's not also necessarily their fault. I mean, Stanford went 3-9, USC went 4-8. I mean, what are you supposed to do about that? Schedule Alabama because USC sucks and hope that this isn't the year that USC gets it back on track and you have to face USC.
When you have to schedule so far
and Alabama, right?
You just don't know what teams are going to be 8 years.
It's not their fault when two of the regular teams in your opponent that for years were considered, one of them was going to be good. I mean, there was always times when USC wasn't that good early in Kelly's tenure, but Stanford was really good, right? So you can't say, well, Kelly feasted on, USC being bad early in his tenure. Oh, okay. But Stanford was one of the 5 to 7 best teams in the country during that schedule. I mean, during that time. So you can't. And then when USC had good years, Stanford was down. And there was a couple times during Kelly's tenure where USC was good and Stanford was pretty decent.
Right.
2017, it wasn't a vintage Stanford team, but they were a 9-win team. They're still a quality football team, and USC won 11 games.
Right.
The problem is the last couple years, the last couple times they've played both, they both stunk. And that's cheapened the schedule a little bit, but there's nothing that you can't fault Notre Dame for that, because you can't assume that they're both going to stink at the same time.
Well, and it's also unfortunate that one of those teams is at the last weekend of the schedule.
Right.
And when you're trying to, there's times where Notre Dame's trying to make a statement in that last game because they don't have the conference championship game and all of that, right? So they're trying to make a statement, and it's like, oh, we're playing this turd team, and they're just not very good. That doesn't do Notre Dame any favors. You know what I mean? From a perception standpoint, going down the stretch.
Agree. Yep. I look at it, Vince, and I'm going to get to the point now where it's like, okay, let's dive into this part of the schedule. But I do think it is smart, and you see Ohio State does it. Alabama does it. Clemson has no choice but to do it because of the conference they play in. But all the top teams schedule smartly. They as best they can break up their big games, and that's why you see so many of these SEC teams schedule FCS teams late November. Usually, a lot of times right before their rivalry games, because they understand. Look, you can't just grind for 13 weeks,
right?
And I say 13 weeks because you normally have a bye. Sometimes it's 14 weeks. You know,
Sure.
if you have one of those weird schedules
A double bye
where you start the season early, right? Like Nate Northwestern starts the week 0, they call it, right? Because they're playing in Ireland. Well, they have 2 byes
next year with the Ireland thing, aren't they?
I think so. Yeah. I think so. I'd have to go. I'd have to look and see when that game is.
When they've played Ireland or in Ireland, they've done it a week ahead of time, so they have,
Right. I'll look actually right now because I think there's one more team that they're still trying to fill. Let me see, 4, 5, 6. And they have all 12. So they are playing that week 0, and then they also have a game in week 1. That's the Tennessee State game. Then they have a bye. Then Central Michigan. Then Ohio State. So they'll have time to get caught up. And then they have another bye.
They got the double bye, yeah.
Right. Well, actually, I don't know if that's not necessarily true because there are 4 to be announced games. So I'm not sure about that as I look through it now. Yeah, 4 of the ACC games have yet to be announced.
Gotcha. So you don't know where those are.
Don't know where those are, how those are going to fall into place.
Sure.
We'll have to see how that goes. But anyway, let's dive into these opponents, Vince, because I think the first game, and we don't spend a whole lot of time on UNLV.
Why not?
I mean, look, this needs to be a game where by halftime it's over and you've got your backups in the second half. And you're getting, and what the point of that game is not just padding stats and all. The point is that is a game where you have to be able to get your starters a lot of time on the bench where they can rest. And it's also a chance where you can get a lot of your number 2s, not just your young guys that are for next year, but your number 2s, right? That's got to be a chance to kind of get those guys some serious work. So that's really the ultimate goal in that game is the how do you define success against a team like UNLV? It's twofold. Number 1, you got to win, right? Number 2 is you just define it success by how quickly can you get your starters out of the game.
Sure. And
that's it to me.
Yeah, and look, and there's a perception of what you should score against a team like UNLV, right? Or the margin. And some of that can be explained away if you've got some of your young guys in there and they give up a touchdown or whatever, right? But it needs to be the product on the field needs to be a dominant product from Notre Dame in the first half. Like they need to leave no doubt, if you will. And yeah, the final score could be lopsided. It should be lopsided. But if it's not completely lopsided, and as long as the starters aren't coming back in, you know what I mean? Like it needs to be a dominant product on the field for the first half. You're at home. They're coming to you. They're not a good football program. You need to take care of your business in the right way, not only so those other guys can get in the game, but because if you're going to be a top team, then you need to be a top team. You know what I mean? We see it all the time with Alabama and Ohio State and Clemson. They blow teams out of UNLV's caliber. Notre Dame needs to do that, right? Yep. And it's not a running up the score situation. It's a, hey, we possess the ball. We're scoring the ball. Like that is what it is, and we're going to turn you over. And if that leads to points, then great. But it just needs to be a dominant performance by Notre Dame if they're going to be considered a top echelon team. It can't be, a game where they squeak by and still get the win. That can't be this game. It has to be domination for me. And that's how I feel about games like UNLV. If you're going to be considered up here, then you need to take care of your business with the lower level teams.
Yeah, and that's got to be it. And this isn't any disrespect to UNLV, and I know the program wants to be better, and hopefully, I mean, I don't know, I wish they were better, but they're not. I mean, you look at their 2 wins last year. They beat New Mexico and they beat Hawaii late. They did have a close loss to San Diego State late, but then they, close loss to San Jose State, close loss to Utah State, close loss to Texas San Antonio, who are all decent teams. They got blown out by Arizona State. They got blown out by Iowa State. They got blown out by Air Force.
Right.
Blown out by Nevada. I mean, this isn't a good football team.
Right.
And there's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. It's not a good football team.
Is what it is, man.
Like this is like Marshall. Like I said, there's a difference between like a Marshall and a UNLV, right? Like you could say, well, Marshall didn't play any Power 5 teams. Okay, so like if you replace and I got your point. This isn't a pushback. But if you took you took the Power Fives off of their schedule and gave them 2 games that they can win. They're 4-8 instead of 2-10. That's still bad, right?
If I was going to have Marshall versus UNLV, I've got my money on the Thundering.
Right. And that was my whole point about, like, no, Marshall's not the worst team on the schedule or even in the conversation for it. It's this is bad, right? Like, the goal against Marshall should be the same against UNLV. Win, and how quickly can you get your starters off the field?
Absolutely.
Right? It's true in both games, but this one is even more necessary for 2 reasons, Vince. Number one, the Marshall game does happen early. And so early, it's like, okay, you actually kind of want to leave your starters in a little bit longer to get them some time together.
Agreed.
So maybe you take it into the fourth quarter or the first series of the fourth quarter if you have a big lead. Hopefully you have a big lead.
Sure.
But against UNLV, this is game 7, Vince.
Correct.
Right? Like, you kind of have an idea of who you are.
October, like, once you're in October, you better know who you are at this point.
Right.
Like, we talked about it in the last show. After 6 games, we're going to have a pretty good idea of who Notre Dame is. And this is game 7, right? So, yeah, absolutely agree with you on that.
It's like, if let's say Tyler Buchner wins a starting quarterback job, which we expect, and he has played most of the snaps first 6 games. I mean, even I'm coming in at halftime and I'm pulling Tyler Buchner and playing Drew Pine, because even if I'm going to put the rest of my starting offense on the field for a series or 2, I want to have my backup quarterback get some snaps with the first team.
Opportunity for that,
right? But it can't do that if it's 24-14. Right. It's gotta be convincing.
It's something that we have wanted for a long time when it comes to whoever the number 2 quarterback is or was. We haven't seen it enough, in my opinion, of where the number 2 quarterback comes in with the rest of the number 1 offense and you're running the offense, not handing the ball off in garbage time. That doesn't matter to me. You or I could go in and hand the ball off. That is not a complicated thing. Right? That doesn't help you get used to throwing the ball to certain guys and reading defenses and all of those things. This is a game where if you want to keep your ones in for a couple series in the second half, or even, to be honest with you, depending on how the game's going, the last couple series of the second quarter, right? I want the second quarterback in with the first team running the offense. That's what I want.
I don't know if in game 7 I would do it in the first half at quarterback. Simply because of it is still Tyler Buchner's first year. Vince, if he was like a returning starter,
so you got more belt, more start.
Yeah, right. Does that make sense? Like, in theory, I don't disagree with you.
Yeah.
We saw Clemson do that in 2019. Like, there was a was it 2020? 2019? No, it was 2020. Early in the year, I think like second game of the year, they were playing an FCS team, and they put in DJ Uiagalelei. It's my best shot at it. And like first quarter, late first quarter, early second, something like that. Like, to your point, like, that's been done before, and I'm not against it at all. It's just, I think that in this instance, since it will just be hopefully number 7 for Tyler Buchner. I mean, hopefully meaning he didn't get hurt.
Right.
I don't know if I would go there just yet. But what you're saying is the same principle that I am saying, which is the halftime. So we're off by a couple series.
And that's splitting hairs. But yes.
But I will say this. I do agree with that with other positions. Like, in the middle of the game, when the game is somewhat still in doubt, if Tobias Merriweather's only been getting 10, 15 snaps a game up to this point, I'm getting him in early.
Sure.
If Jadarian Price is only getting a couple carries a game because the other guys are playing better, I might get him in a series early, let him run behind that line first series of second quarter, something like that. You know, like, those are the places. If Josh Burnham's been playing for you and you've burned his red shirt's gone,
right,
I may get him in on some pass rush snaps, or Aiden Gobira, or Tyson Ford.
Really good idea by game 7 what your red shirt situation is.
Right.
I mean,
so I would rotate those guys in a little, like, one at a time, 1 or 2 at a time. Right. I'm not doing the mass substitutions where you got your backup offensive line, you're starting quarterback in the second quarter. I'm not talking about that. But I do think those are games, and that is definitely true of Marshall. Like, I don't even think that needs to be until game 7. Like, I would work in those guys second quarter of the opener of the opening home game.
Guys that you think are going to have a role,
right?
Maybe it's not an expanded role yet, but if you see them getting on the field,
right?
I don't want to say crunch time, but in a game situation,
right,
get them some more time. Absolutely.
Because the point you're making, Vince, is we're not talking about getting guys one of their 4 games in the first half.
Right.
Right. The redshirt guys are going to only play 4 games. No. Wait till the second half for that. We're talking about guys that are not redshirts that maybe haven't got a chance to play a ton that you think can really help you down the stretch or the end of quarter 3
right.
when you play Clemson. Or give you or secure your depth a little bit. So it's more those guys is what I'm talking about, as opposed to like let's get your freshman offensive lineman who you're only going to play 4 games in the game. That's not what we're talking. That's key for this game, Vince. But that's third, fourth quarter stuff.
I'm talking more like, for example, maybe junior Tuai Alamaka. If he's not
starting by then,
granted, right. But if he's pushing,
right.
Guess what? This is a great opportunity. Hey.
Right.
You're pushing our starter right now. Right. Let's see what you got. And he's in there with the starters. Like that.
100%.
That's the example that came to my head, as a guy that could be that guy.
That's what this game needs to be about. Mm-hmm. You need to be able to do that. And you're going to know a lot about your team, about whether you're able to handle that. Because that also results in a little bit more, Vince, of that's got to include some more reps that we can practice too.
Sure.
Not a ton, but like if that's going to be because if you're going to do that, Vince, it's your plan going in. It's not like we'll see how it goes, and play it by ear. You prepare for that going into the game. Now, not the way they did it for Ball State in 2018, where they literally were given the third string like number 1 reps.
That's not. Yeah.
In week 2, this is a different situation.
Right.
So
that's
what the UNLV game is about. And then, of course, the final key to UNLV game is come out of it healthy. Like those are always the biggest fears with games like that is come out of it healthy. And then you get into quarter 2. Now, this is an interesting game, Vince, because from a pure matchup standpoint, Syracuse doesn't scare me, but it is a game where if you're not locked in, this could be a more challenging game than people think. It could be a lose momentum game. Sure. And here's why I say that. It's going to be at the Carrier Dome, which is a very unique atmosphere than what these kids have ever played in. Just the whole, from what I'm told, looks different. The playing surface is different. The vision. I mean, we've heard this from basketball players for years. Like it's hard to shoot free throws in the Carrier Dome because it's such a different view. It's deeper. It's
a backboard, and it's just like never ending.
Right.
Right. With you and your
and same thing is true in football.
Right.
And so this is what I like. This is why I want them to not move the game away from the Carrier Dome, because I want them to have sort of that mentally challenging experience, sure. Right? But here's the other part of it is, Syracuse is not a super talented team. I do like Dino Babers as a coach. He's been disappointing the last few years, but I really felt like last year Syracuse became a much more competitive team at times, and then they would fade. Like, they took Florida State, they beat Liberty, which is a big win, beat my former boss, who's at Albany, took Wake Forest down to the wire, took Clemson down to the wire, lost those 2 games by combined 6 points. Then they go on the road and beat Virginia Tech. Then they beat Boston College by 15. That was with Phil Dracovic having just come back. So it's not, you can't even blame it on them not having to fill. Now, he wasn't 100%, but he played in that game. And then you go out and lose your last 3 games to Louisville, NC State, and Pitt, and not one of them was competitive. So it's like all that momentum. They were starting to build 3 straight 3-point losses and then 2 back-to-back big wins for them. And then,
yeah.
But the reality is this is a decent football team. And the biggest thing about it is this. They got a really good running back coming back in Sean Tucker. If you remember him, he's the kid, Vince, that rushed for that. It was like an 80-some yard touchdown against Notre Dame's backup.
I remember 2 years ago. Yeah, I remember that.
Really quality back. They've got a pretty good offense, and Ryan talked about this recently. They got a pretty good offensive line coming back, a pretty physical offensive line coming back, and they have a very mobile quarterback in Garrett Schrader. Now, he wasn't much of a passer last year, but this is a kid. The interesting thing about him is this is a kid, Vince, that has started games in the SEC. He began his career at Mississippi State and started as a true freshman at Mississippi State, started multiple games against Mississippi State. In 2019, he threw for 238 yards. If you remember that LSU Mississippi State game in 19, LSU eventually wore him out and won by 23. But Mississippi State kept it close for a while. And Garrett Schrader was running around and made some plays in that game. Yeah. So this is a kid that's got a lot of experience. I think last year it took him a while to kind of find himself as a passer, and he never really did.
Yeah.
I mean, 3 of his last 4 games, that he didn't even have 100 yards passing. He did go 17 of 24 for 217 and 2 touchdowns in the last game against Pitt, but the kid can run. He had 3 games with at least 137 yards rushing, including against Florida State and Wake Forest. He had 174 against Virginia Tech. He had 78 against BC, 70 against North NC State, 53 against Liberty, 42 against Albany. This is a kid that can hurt you with his legs. And what's the one kryptonite that we've always talked about this Notre Dame team? Now, again, until they prove us otherwise, we can't just assume because there's new coaches, because it was a problem for Bob Diaco. It was a problem for everything. Was a problem for Brian Van Gorder. It was a problem for Mike Elko. It was a problem for Clark Lee. It was a problem for Marcus Freeman. And until Al Golden proves that he has an answer for it, it's going to be a problem. We have to consider this as a problem when talking about matchups.
Absolutely.
So it's one of those things where, do I expect Notre Dame to lose this game? No, I'd be shocked if Notre Dame loses this game. But could Syracuse maybe make this a little bit more challenging than you hope it to be? Absolutely.
Well, and
that's the concern.
Yeah, and there's a lot of how do I want to say this? It's an away game. It's at a weird place. It's against a team who's got some weapons, and again, I'm with you. I do not expect Notre Dame to lose this game in any way, shape, or form. They should be 7-1 going into the Clemson game. I fully anticipate that being the case. But there's just, and depending on injuries and all of those things that you can't predict, there's just a lot of weirdness about going to Syracuse. It's not, there's nothing around Syracuse. There's not, I mean, and again, the Carrier Dome's a weird place. There's just a lot of things that are strange about this game. And that's why it can be a trip-up game. This is why it can be, it fits the definition of a trap game, right? And again, I think you said this in the last show or maybe the show before that, a trap game doesn't necessarily mean you're going to lose. But a trap game can knock you off of your pedestal and knock you off.
Lose that momentum.
That you're on. And by golly, Notre Dame needs the momentum going into the Clemson game. They do.
I mean, because you look at you're 100% right. You look at 2015, Vince, Notre Dame turned the ball over 5 times against BC, including 3 times inside the 10-yard line, and still won, right? Because BC was terrible. Notre Dame had one of its worst offensive performances in years against Wake Forest and still won by 21, right? Like, those were bad teams. That's like the 3rd time I've thrown that pen out of my hand during the show. But it's whoop, there you go. But you still won those games and won them convincingly, but you lost momentum in those back-to-back games. Your perception took a hit. You lost momentum. You got out of rhythm of what made you, effective. And so, if you can go into Syracuse, and that's, I mean, confidence is part of it. Yeah, it's not, that's part of it. Agree with you. I'm more looking for it from a timing, a cohesion, like, boy, we're just really clicking, it's like, it's more, so it's like, if Vince, we've all played sports, right? Whether it's at a practice or in a game, you're playing basketball, right? And you're just, man, I don't know what it is, but it's like, everything feels good. Like, baseball is that way for me sometimes. Yeah, like, absolutely, man, when I was pitching, like, I just felt, man, I felt good. I feel like, man, this is something that, I can just put this ball wherever I want. I'm throwing easy gas. Like, and then you have that one inning where you're like, oh, that doesn't feel right when and you lose it.
Yep.
And sometimes you can get it back. Sometimes you can't.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's the same thing with a football game. When you lose that momentum, that cohesiveness, that sharpness, and you start to maybe doubt yourself, or you're like, well, gee, that's weird, or we got to fix that, or whatever. All of a sudden, it's like, but it can be hard to get that back. And that's what a game like Syracuse is. I'm not so much concerned. I think Notre Dame's past that. Again, Marcus Freeman needs to prove that he could do what Brian Kelly did. Like, that's the thing for Marcus Freeman. At minimum, he's got to at least repeat what Brian Kelly did. And what did Brian Kelly do? He beat the teams he's supposed to beat, right? I'm gonna give you a stat, Vince. Yeah. I'm gonna give you a stat. In Brian Kelly's 12 years at Notre Dame, they went 19-29 against teams that finished ranked in the top 25. That's in 12 years. So that's 48 games. In his 11 years at Notre Dame, Lou Holtz's teams went 31-23-2 against top 5 teams, or top 20 teams that finished in the top 25. Now, here's where Brian Kelly really, 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 really dominated. In his years, Notre Dame went 93-12 against teams that finished the year unranked. And if you go through his tenure, it had been a while since Notre Dame had lost to a team that finished the season unranked. And I think it was actually 2016 was the last time that happened, that they lost a game to a team that finished ranked, unranked. And I don't even think teams were, even teams that all the teams they lost to were ranked when they played them and finished ranked. You'd have to go back to 2016 for that abysmal season to Navy 2016. That was the weekend we got Rita. That's how long ago that was, right? Because I've told you the story. I told Angela she was working at our dog had passed away that summer, and my wife needed some dog time, so she was volunteering at the local shelter, and I was going to Jacksonville for the day. I said, "Do not bring a dog home," and of course, she brought Rita home. So anyway, that's how much pull I got in my house, and I'm glad she didn't listen to me because I love that girl. But anyway, that's a long time since Notre Dame lost to an unranked opponent, right? Like, say whatever you want about Brian Kelly, that's where the program got significantly better than it was under previous coaches, because in a lot of those 12 losses happened in his first 5-6 years when he was building the program up.
Right.
You look at he went 93-12. Charlie Weiss against unranked teams went 34-15. Ty Willingham went 13-6. Bob Davie went 30-11. Lou Holtz went 69-7. So if you look at Kelly's record against ranked opponents, he was very similar to what Charlie and Davie was, right? Ty and Charlie were. Like Davie. Charlie was bad against ranked teams. Charlie went 1-12 against teams that finished ranked. Ty went 8-9. Davie went 5-14. Kelly is 19-29. It's very similar to them against ranked teams, but here's where he was way better. And this is why Brian Kelly should be defined as a good coach.
Right.
Absolutely. Right? Not a great coach, but a significantly better coach than before, because he got to the program 93-12 against unranked opponents, compared to 34-15 for Charlie, 13-6 for Ty, and 30-11 for Bob Davie. Right? And so you've got to at least continue to be that. You can't afford to have the slip up there. The question now is, can you take it to what he could do, which is to beat the top 25 team? And that's where a game like this is where you learn something about Marcus Freeman and the staff, because it's the second road game, but it's the second road game against a non-big opponent, because the BYU game to me is not a road game. That's a neutral site game. It's in Las Vegas.
It's a Shamrock series, so it's essentially a Notre Dame home game as far as all the
pretty much. Yeah. Ohio State's a road game. Carolina's a road game, but this is third. The first one you're going to be ready for. I mean, mentally ready for. The North Carolina game, I don't see Notre Dame overlooking, because they're a good opponent. They're going to be potentially ranked in the top 25. This is the game where maybe you overlook your opponent.
Right.
And so this is the game that we learn, okay, what is this Notre Dame? This is another one of those. What is the leadership of this football team going to be like?
Absolutely.
And that's another takeaway from this game. So, yes, it's about the momentum. It's about continue to grow as a team. It's about, getting ready for Clemson and all that. But it's also about how locked in can you be on your football team. And the schedule sets up nicely, because I really like the fact that the week before they play Notre Dame, Syracuse has to play at Clemson.
Oh,
so you're going to be the Clemson stuff a week later is going to be really fresh in your mind. But it gives you a measuring stick, in my opinion, about where you are compared to Clemson and all that. Those are just some of the little side nuggets of this game. But then the final piece, Vince, is, can you finally show that you can go out and slow down a mobile quarterback? That's going to be another key for this game.
Sure, absolutely. Now, let me ask you from a coach's standpoint, does it ever worry you when you've got a team that you're preparing for who's, subpar to par, whatever, and they happen to be playing that team that you're playing the next week who's really good, and that's the film you're watching? Like, that's a lot of the film that you're watching is them playing that team that you're playing next week. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
The players are like looking at the other team as opposed to the team.
Absolutely. 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 No question. And that's why I say, like, that's why this game concerns me, you know, compared to North Carolina, compared to because like Ohio State, all your folks, no one's worried about Marshall.
Game one.
Right. In North Carolina, it's you've got to buy the next week. That's the game to worry about. And they gave you a test last year. So you're going to be ready for that one. This one's different because you got the big boy coming right next week.
Yep. Absolutely.
And you're going to spend the whole week watching film of that team.
Exactly.
And so, yeah, I think that's a really good point, Vince. It's a really good point. You know, but that goes back to, you know, what I had said earlier, and I wasn't thinking about this. So you definitely put something in my mind that I wasn't thinking of when I said it, but it falls under that category of this is where you learn what kind of leadership you have as a football team. And whenever you and I talk about leadership, we're always talking about player leadership. Because at the end of the day, that's what's got to be strong. You listen to the players that played in the 1988 team. Lou Holtz set a standard of this is the excellence that we demand.
Yeah.
But the reason that it worked isn't because he said it and demanded it and was hard on him to practice. It's because the captains of those teams lived it and demanded it. Now, you may not like it, but we got something bigger in mind here, right? And that's something that, to me, you learn a lot. These are the games you learn a lot about your football team. Absolutely. And if you don't play well, it doesn't define you. It doesn't mean, oh, gee, you're not a great team, because – I mean, we could go back to that 1988 team, and there were some ugly wins that 1988 year, because it's like you said, it's hard to get locked in. I mean, they beat the week before Miami, and this is to your point, Vince. I think this is a great example. Is a week before they played Miami, they played a not very good Pittsburgh team and won 30-20. But if you remember, it was kind of an ugly game. You know, it wasn't a super pretty game. And, you know, you were thinking about Miami, right? I mean, you beat Navy, a 3-8 Navy team that year. You beat them 22-7, right? It was an ugly game. You beat a 5-6 Penn State team 21-3, a little sloppy win. But what did that team do every time after that? They bounced back and dominated the big. They were able to rise to the occasion, because it's not so much that you play perfect football, but are you at least focused? Are you at least locked in? Are you at least not avoiding getting into the bad habits? It's not so much that you've got to go out and win by 50.
Right.
It's the momentum is more about it's more about the cohesion. It's about are you staying true to your preparation? Are you staying true to your discipline? Are you staying true to the things that makes you who you are? Because every team's going to have an up and down performance. I mean, one of the best teams I ever saw in my lifetime was that 2001 Miami team. And they had a couple games where you're like, boy, they almost lost that one. I think it was 2001 is when they had that crazy Ed Reed return fumble for a touchdown to help them beat BC. You know, I mean, that was a pretty competitive game. Beat BC 18-7, right? I mean, that was a team you look at the schedule, you're thinking, well, BC's not the team that's going to have a better shot to beat them than Syracuse. So I think McNabb wasn't on that team. He was already in the NFL. But that was a highly ranked Syracuse team. You beat number 12 Washington 65-7. You beat number 14 Florida State 49-27. You beat Penn State 33-7. Then, of course, they killed Nebraska in the title game. But BC gave them a run for their money. Why? Because, you know, you can't be on every single week when you play decent teams. But just because you didn't play well doesn't mean you lose momentum. You lose momentum, Vince, because you get out of your rhythm. You lose your discipline. You lose your focus. You lose all those kind of things. And that's the key. And you need that. I'm going to segue this one like a champ. You need that because going into that next week, you've got to bring your A game. Now, Clemson. I don't know if this is not going to be 2018 Clemson.
Agreed.
It's not.
Agreed.
It's not probably going to be 2016 Clemson, but it's going to be better than last year's Clemson. And this is the game, Vince, that whether you're, 7-1, 8-0, whatever the case may be, this is a big game for Notre Dame. It's a big game in two aspects, and we talked about this in the original show, I believe. Maybe you and I just talked about it, and we forgot to bring it up in the show. It all kind of bleeds together. But not only is it a big game for 2022, for all the reasons we talked about before, this is the game you overcome a potential loss earlier. This is the game where if you're undefeated, you solidify your top 4. Because if they're undefeated coming into this game, they're in the top 4.
Absolutely.
Now, I don't know if this is going to be the first Saturday in November, so I would imagine there has been at least one college football playoff ranking coming out by that point in time.
I think they come out week 8. Does that sound right? Or am I just making things up?
It'll be week 9, but it's usually like late October, usually.
Okay.
But it also depends on, how many buys and when the season starts. It's like all that kind of weird stuff. So, I mean, usually Notre Dame will have 8 games under their belt. There's usually at least 4 to 5 rankings, right? So there's probably been at least one college football playoff ranking. And Vince, you may look up, see if they have it on there when the rankings come out. But you may have at least one college football playoff ranking. If you are in the top 4, then this game solidifies it. If you're outside of the top 4 because you have a loss, this is the kind of game that allows you to jump way in there, right? Because even if Clemson isn't what they've been, they're still going to be pretty good, in my opinion. Like this version of Clemson, in my opinion, is going to be better than last year's version of Clemson. Sure. I truly believe that. I don't have evidence of it per se. I know there's a lot of Clemson fans that are kind of flipping out about, who they hired and a bunch of, guys that don't have reputations and all that. And, Dabo's kind of banking on it. But the reality is their schedule coming into this game is pretty easy.
Well,
if we're being honest.
I will also say, looking at the rest of Clemson's schedule, this is by far their biggest game of the year.
100 by big time. Not close.
Not close. I mean, if we're going to talk strength of schedule and all of that, and again, I'm not necessarily holding it against Clemson because they're in the ACC and they have to play ACC games, but their non-conference is Furman, Louisiana Tech, and South Carolina.
And then Notre Dame, right.
And, I mean, again, the Notre Dame game is by far their biggest test. So even if Syracuse, if Clemson goes 11-1 and they lose to Notre Dame, they're going to have all of the conversation that was surrounding Notre Dame about strength of schedule, in my opinion.
They'll probably be out.
Right. That's what I'm saying.
It depends on depends on the quality of the game. It depends on 2 things. Number 1, quality of the game, and then how much they dominate everybody else.
Yeah.
I don't think it's a guarantee. Here's the interesting. I don't think it's a guarantee that Clemson's undefeated when they come play Notre Dame.
Okay.
And because there's NC State supposedly is going to be good this year. Now, for me, I need to see Dave Dorn show me he can put together 2 good seasons in a row. He hasn't shown he can do that yet. Like one good year, and then they have high expectations next year, and they falter. I wonder if him and Matt Campbell have a lot in common, right? Where Matt Campbell's done a lot of good things at Iowa State, but the one year that they had high expectations, they kind of faltered.
Yes, they did.
And we've seen that with NC State as well.
You got Boston College, which –
you got NC State at home, but then surrounded the NC State game, you've got Wake Forest on the road. Now, Clemson has dominated Wake Forest. Like, that's just a bad matchup for Wake Forest. But that's still a good Wake Forest football team. Like, that's a dangerous Wake Forest football team. But then you have at Boston College, which you and I don't think is going to be a cakewalk.
Sure.
And then you're at Florida State. And that, to me, is the biggest wild card on their schedule. Because I just don't know what Florida State's going to be. They've got a lot of athletes coming back. They've now gotten even rid of more and more of the attitude problems that are there. They recruited better this past year, still not anywhere close to vintage Florida State, but they're recruiting better. And it's the combination of that plus it's coming off of a tough 3-game stretch beforehand of at Wake, home against NC State, at BC. Are they kind of overlooking that as they also start to kind of look ahead a little bit? If they're undefeated, do they start peeking ahead at what's coming down the road, or is Florida State still big enough of an opponent where they're locked in? Those are all questions about Clemson, but at worst, in my opinion, they'll have 1 loss at worst. Because, and the reason I say that, Vince, is even if their offense is as bad as it was last year, there's no Georgia on the schedule.
Right.
And some of the teams that they lost to last year, they lost on the road. Like, I just don't see them being that bad, but even like last year, they lost at NC State in overtime. They get NC State at home. Last year, they lost at Pitt. Well, Pitt doesn't have Kenny Pickett and Jordan Addison anymore. That's not a problem. And Huh?
Do they have Pitt on their schedule? I don't remember seeing Pitt.
No.
Yeah.
No, it was a crossover game.
Yeah.
Like other division game.
Yeah.
But they would have to potentially play Pitt in the ACC championship game.
Sure.
Which they have done before. So you look at it and you say, even as bad as Clemson was last year, they lost by 7 points to the eventual national champions in a game where the other team didn't score a single offensive touchdown. They lost in overtime to NC State. They lost by 10 to Pitt. That was a convincing win. And then after that, they ran the table the rest of the way. And it wasn't super convincing. But their defense is going to be older, healthier, and really good.
With a new defensive coordinator, too.
Yes. Who at least showed he impressed me in the bowl game. He did. He impressed me in the bowl game. But even then, Vince, sometimes, especially in the ACC, your talent is so good that you can't screw it up.
Sure.
Unless you're like just Brian McGorder, and I don't think this guy is that.
Right. I get that.
And so, you're talking about the best defensive line in college football.
Sure.
You're talking about a really athletic group of linebackers. You're talking about a pretty good secondary. I think their offense is going to be better. I don't think their offense is going to be what it's been in the past. I don't think it's going to be anywhere close to that.
And I still think Clemson's offense is going to struggle with athletic fronts.
Yes.
And somebody was mentioning, I think it was Chris Ayers is mentioning the wide receivers that Clemson had. Of course, they're going to have great wide receivers. They always have for the past 10 years, right? But
no, not last year.
Okay, well, that's fair. I'm just saying, I don't care who they got on the outside. They got to get them the ball.
I'm not trading Clemson's receivers for Notre Dame's right now.
Get them the ball.
Yeah, right.
Okay? And that's my whole point is they got to get them the ball. And that means that DJ, who is not very mobile, is going to have time to get the ball out.
Because the question that Chris had is, what position groups does Clemson have a recruiting ranking edge over Notre Dame on? I don't care. Chris, this is a fair question. I'm saying, like, I don't care. I don't look at it that way. I don't really care. I care about what are they on the field. And when I look at Clemson, I don't think their D line is going to be great because Brian Breezy and Miles Murphy were 5 stars. They're great because when you pop into film, they're freaking great. You know what I mean? Like, they're really good.
Mm-hmm.
Just like their offense is going to be good because DJ was a 5-star. He's not, right? I mean, at least he hasn't shown that, in my opinion.
Nope.
And so, to me, when I look at that matchup, I say, the question, Chris, I'll tell you, do me one favor, Chris, okay? He asked a question about on paper, has better overall talent, Clemson or Notre Dame. I'll say Notre Dame by a hair. Chris, that's a great question. Can you remember to bring that back later in the summer when we actually focus more on we're going to go through and kind of do each of the 12 teams for the most part, where we're going to not look at it from a schedule standpoint, but really dive into those teams and talk about players and matchups and all that kind of stuff. Because I think that would be a much better time to have that conversation. This isn't so much a matchup discussion as more of a big picture, what does this game mean discussion? Because your question is great, Chris. It's just, I think let's save that for a future down the road show. And Chris is a regular, so I'm sure he'll remember that. But I think that's a better time to get there. But like John A1 says, I think Clemson is the only defense that can actually dominate Notre Dame up front. I don't think they can. If Notre Dame's as good as we think they can be, they won't dominate Notre Dame. They didn't dominate Notre Dame in 2018 with a great D-line. They didn't dominate Notre Dame up front in 2016 with a great D-line. But what it does, to John's point, is they can neutralize Notre Dame's dominance at that position. And that's what they did in 2018. That's what they did in 2016. That's what Georgia did in 2017. It's not that Georgia dominated Notre Dame's O-line. They neutralized Notre Dame's dominance. And Clemson's one of the few teams that has that. So I think this is a big show-me game for both teams. If Clemson's undefeated, odds are they're not going to have beaten anybody that's highly ranked. I don't see NC State with a home loss to Clemson being super highly ranked. I don't see Florida State being highly ranked. BC, Wake Forest. Yeah. They're not. This is going to be a show-me game for Clemson.
Absolutely.
And it's going to be a show-me, like, okay, Notre Dame, are you legit?
Yes.
Because you beat Ohio State, but you haven't really beat a ton of great teams late. Are you legit? Or okay, you lost Ohio State. Is this same old Notre Dame where you go 10-2 and beat all the teams you're supposed to beat, but lose to the others? That's going to be the test.
This game, regardless of what happens against Ohio State, because there's going to be plenty of talking heads out there, they're going to dismiss a win against Ohio State as fluky for Notre Dame, because that's just what they're going to do, right?
First game, new coaches, blah, blah, blah.
A million excuses. There's going to be a million excuses, okay? And now when you had the Clemson game 7 weeks later, or 8 weeks later, excuse me, I think this is where you're going to get people's attention. So let's say they're 7-1. They lost a close game to Ohio State. It's same old Notre Dame. They can't beat the big boys. And then they beat Clemson. It's gonna be like, oh, they were fully healthy. They had everybody that they needed. Blah 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 blah. Okay, we got to take Notre Dame seriously. If they beat Ohio State and they're undefeated going into the Clemson game, it's still a huge game because now it's gonna. Those talking heads who made all the excuses are gonna be like, well, okay, Notre Dame is legit. Right. They just beat an undefeated Clemson and they beat Ohio State. We're going to have to take these guys seriously. Mm-hmm. So that's why, regardless of what happens against Ohio State, I still think this is an absolutely huge game from a national perspective, from a perception perspective, and for this team. Because if they lose to Ohio State and they win the next 7 games, okay, that's great. But if they can beat Clemson at home, that's huge for confidence. That's huge for momentum, especially moving into what they've got the rest the latter.
It's a great resume builder. Yes, because Clemson will be ranked, in my opinion. The question is, are they going to be a top 5? Because they're a preseason top 5 team. I haven't done my top 25 yet. I don't know if I'm going to feel good about putting them in the top 5. I'm not just assuming Clemson's going to get back on track because you can't look at it as those down year, but everybody's back. They're going to be fine. I mean, they completely remade their coaching staff. And it's either going to be a great success and Dabo's going to win Coach of the Year because he hired a bunch of guys no one's ever heard of, or it's going to be, okay, it's probably why you probably shouldn't have hired a bunch of guys nobody's ever heard of. You know what I mean? Like, we don't know. So I'm just not jumping like the assumption that A&M is going to be great and Clemson's going to be great and all this other stuff. I think we're going to have a top 25 show this summer where maybe a couple where we do our top 25, but then also talk about others and who we think's overrated, underrated, maybe part of the same show, whatever. But they're going to be top 10 to 15 for sure, in my opinion. And so, and Irish One just said, let's hope Clemson's undefeated when we play them. 100%. And that's the thing is, if with the schedule they play, if they're at the very least 7-1, I think, what did we count, Vince? There was 8 games before they played Notre Dame.
Yeah, something
I think
like that.
9 games. Let me go count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 8. So they'll be if we're 7-1, they're going to be a top 20 team in my view.
Right.
So it's a chance for a big win. And big picture, Vince, another win over Clemson, especially if it can be a game where you were clearly the better team. Like in 2020, Notre Dame outplayed Clemson, but it was more of like they had to build up the big lead and then hold Clemson off. Where it was kind of like, and then you could say, well, Clemson didn't have Trevor, they didn't have Tyler Davis, they didn't have Mike Jones,
an excuse is already built in. I mean,
right. It didn't have Justin Ross, he was out for the year.
Right,
they were legit excuses. I mean, they were, and then you saw in the rematch what happened, right?
Absolutely.
But as long as there's not something like that, if you can win to where it's clear you're the better team, this is a big picture statement game. Because we talk about, remember, Lou and I used to do the thing together, and I don't know if you and him did it together when you worked with him, but we did that tiers conversation. And where's Notre Dame in the tiers? Well, you're not truly in tier 1, in my opinion, until you win a title, or you're just consistently, that level. But you're close. Notre Dame's knocking on the door. This could be that thing where you really kick it open and say, hey, we're here from a recruiting standpoint, from a program standpoint, where you say, hey, look, that era is behind us, that era where we couldn't beat good teams unless there was some mitigating circumstance, right? And so that's another opportunity to do that, because this is Clemson's not Georgia. They're not Alabama. They're not Ohio State, meaning they're not a historical blue blood program. Yes, they've won a title in the past in 1981 with Danny Ford, but they're not considered on the same level historically as Notre Dame, Bama, Ohio State, Michigan, programs like that. Can we all agree on that? I think we should all be able to agree on that.
Absolutely.
So to me, they're teetering on that level of dominance. Their recruiting's not great right now. And they had that down year to where if they kind of go out this year and get smacked by the only good team that they play, they could fall hard. And now that's one more team that Notre Dame has now ascended in their chase to a championship. So it could be that thing. It's kind of like, is Clemson that heavyweight fighter that's kind of getting a little bit long in the tooth, and the upstart's got a chance to knock him out? And that's what game also to me signifies that as well. I think it's a great opportunity for a big picture victory as well. Yes. And also big picture, if you lose, you're not there yet.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And that's what that game means to me.
If you lose this game, that means you probably lost Ohio State. And now
I wouldn't say that. I don't.
Well, it just depends on how things are going. I'll
say this.
One,
whether they even if they beat Ohio State, to your point, it's still you'd said it earlier. There's going to be all the excuses, first game, blah 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 blah, and so they're then gonna harp on the second game,
right?
That they lost. That's what the focus will be on.
Absolutely,
rightfully so, because if you're trying to be Bama, Georgia, those teams, you've got to win these type of games, especially at home. You can't say, well, we split with those two teams. No, beat them both. Right, that's the objective. That's the standard. So, anyway, that's kind of how I look at it. Vince is there's big 2022 implications, but there's even more to it than just that in this game against Clemson, and that's what makes this. You start the third quarter off with arguably the worst team you're going to play, and you could make a case that this is going to be the best team that they play. Now, I think Ohio State's going to be a better team overall. But is Ohio State in week 1 going to be better than Clemson in week 10? Right? That's what I don't know. Because Clemson's also going to be coming off of a bye. And so they're going to be able to get fresh. And that's one thing we've always said. We give respect to byes if it's a chance for a team to get healthy. And that's what it could be for Clemson. So that's the question. Is Ohio State in week 1 going to be better than Clemson in week 10? That's the discussion. That's the debate. In regards to the best team that they play. Maybe not the highest ranked, but the best team. That's what we'll find out. Can you beat that team? And it's going to tell us a whole lot about Notre Dame.
Absolutely. So that's why the third quarter is really, really important to this team and the momentum that they're going to have moving into the fourth quarter, which we will be talking about next week. So make sure you stay tuned.
Not Tuesday. One quick note. I ended up not having jury duty last time because they canceled late and they pushed me back to the 31st. So I am right now scheduled for jury duty on Tuesday. So we may record a show and play it or something else, but it won't be me live with you. But we will get to it at some point in time next week.
We got the fourth quarter coming next week, so make sure you stay tuned for that.
And we have a show tonight as well.
Tonight, yes. Thank you for that reminder. There's a commitment coming. We're going to track.
No, there's a commitment show coming.
Well, no, I didn't say he's committing somewhere.
Yes. Okay.
Coming.
Yes. Okay. Okay. I just read that as Notre Dame's getting a commitment. Like, hold on now. We're not saying that.
I didn't say that. There's a young man who is about to commit someplace, and Irish Breakdown will have a show to talk about that commitment and where he ends up going.
Yes,
so that's Jayden Lamar, the running back out of Washington.
Yeah.
And he is going to commit tonight to somewhere.
Notre Dame, Michigan, Oregon, or Arizona.
Yep. So
I do love this. First of all, thanks for the super chat, Chris. But he says, I still love your example of Ohio State was Captain American Endgame. If we beat Ohio State and Clemson, Notre Dame will be like Black Panther walking in next to Ohio State. Then SEC will be like, here we go. And I think that's important for Notre Dame. I mean, I think that's important for college football, that it's not just Ohio State standing on the edge of the battlefield against this unsurmountable foe that is the SEC. Like you said, it's like, Clemson's got to be whoever you want Clemson to be. Is it Thor? Is it Iron Man? I don't care. Then you've got to have the other. I think that's a great point. And hopefully, someday, if there is a program that's standing on the edge of the SEC monstrosity and everybody else is, hopefully Notre Dame can become Captain America. Of course, I would have preferred, because that's my favorite Marvel character. But yeah, that's what I'm hoping that this season can be.
Yep.
Where Notre Dame can become that program. But yes, I thank you for that super chat.
All right. So make sure you tune in tonight at 7:00. That is when that show will kick off.
We'll have a Q&A afterwards as well.
Q&A after that one as well. And then, of course, tomorrow is the biggest Q&A of them all. It's the Friday free for all week. So make sure you tune in for that one as well. So for Brian Driscoll, I'm Vince D'Addario, and we will talk to you next time on the Irish Breakdown Podcast.